Dr. Rich, and I am the director of the Center for Nation Spirituality. A few months ago, I listened a two-part podcast in the AMDJ, Mayor and Dei Gloria, the Jesuit podcast, interviewing Father David Collins of the Society of Jesus about his new book, The Jesuits in the U.S., A Concise History. I immediately bought the book, read it, contacted him, and asked him to come to visit to present it. His response was quick and generous from the very beginning. So thank you very much for being here with all of us. I also, at the same time, contacted Seth Meehan, a historian himself, a colleague of Father Collins, and the Associate Director for Academic Programs and Special Projects of the Office of the University Librarian, to see if BC libraries will be interested in co-sponsoring this event. He and Tom Wall, the University Librarian, immediately responded, embracing my proposal. So thank you both as well. The reason why we are having this presentation in this space, I think is very, very simple. I am a big proponent of using the spaces for the original purposes they were intended. And a library, and this library specifically, is without a doubt the right space to present a book that is so infused and so with our history and idiosyncrasy. Even more, the Jesuits in the US is not only a good fit for this space, but also for people like us who, working in a Jesuit institution and not being professional historians, want to approach its history in a rigorous but also concise way. That is, without the excessive verbosity, details, and detours of other more ambitious books.
Don't set them up for disappointment.
I think that this book has the right size, and Father Collins made the right call writing it. So let me say a few words about the author. Father David Collins is an associate professor of history and the Haub director of the Catholic Studies programs at Georgetown University. A fun fact about him is that he was born at the Georgetown University Hospital, and no, he has left the university since then. Father Collins entered the Society of Jesus in 1987. Upon completing his doctorate in medieval history at Northwestern University, he returned to DC in 2004. During his 20 years of training as a Jesuit, he has been in Philadelphia, Boston, Munich, and Chicago. Of all those places, Germany seems to have imprinted the most indelible mark on him. As a scholar, he has focused his research in the late Middle Ages, publishing extensively on the cult of the saints, Renaissance humanism, and learned magic, especially in German. So I asked Father Collins to lecture for about 30 minutes so that we can have some extra time for questions and answers at the end of this lunch. So join me with a round of applause to welcome Father David Collins.
So, have I got the mic on? No? How about now? 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 Oh, there we go. How about this? I got a green light at least. Oh, okay. So, I thank you for the very kind introduction. I'm a late medieval Germanist as a historian, and usually when I give talks on things I've written, sort of the audience maxes out at 6. So I'm delighted that the turnout has been what it is. I'm very grateful for your interest. The only time I have an audience more than 6, it's because they're anticipating a final exam at the end of the month, and I promise you that that's not coming. It is indeed going to be a little tough it was tough enough to write a book called A Concise History. It's going to be that much tougher for me to present it to you in a concise format, but I'll do the best that I can. And a lot of it, the way I think it might be best to sort of dive into this project and this book is for me to just pull out certain things emblematically. And the first is themes, and I'm going to identify them as themes that if you'd asked me 15 years ago when I started teaching Jesuit scholastics about the history of the Jesuit order in the United States, I would not have been quite conscious of, but that 15 years of teaching and then really these few years of writing, basically writing up the lectures and seminars and putting them in book format, sort of came into ever sharper relief. And then in each of those instances, I could talk for hours about any one of them, but to just take out a few emblematic characters that will help us cover. I want to be geographically equitable and get a little bit from both coasts in the middle, and I want to be chronologically equitable, get some colonial material in here, some 19th century material, some 20th century material. And the theme of the book really, in terms of the information that it provides and what I'm hoping to do with readers and listeners, is to whet the appetite. Because there's so much more that could be said in the 50,000 words of the book, or in the 50 minutes of time we'll have together. So in terms of chronology, geography, threads to keep your ear out for, one would be the Jesuit struggle to work with what might be called the settler and the indigenous. The settler and the indigenous, and thinking analogically into the 20th or 21st century, you might also think of the pull between working with the churched and the unchurched. A second thread would be understanding where Catholicism survives, or where it thrives, survives, ought to be vis-a-vis mainstream American society. And I talk a little bit in the book about the sort of the mainstreaming pull, pulling Catholics into the mainstream, shaping the mainstream, versus an isolationist or the construction of the maintenance of a Catholic ghetto, which we find people talking about in the 18th century in certain ways, in the 20th century in certain ways, is a very American way of being, sitting on the hill. You can go and lose yourself and create a community all for yourself. Let's say like the Amish, right? And then maybe a third is to just keep in mind the ways that American Jesuit history shouldn't be isolated as part of American history. I mean, that can be a real danger in any of these kind of histories, and Americans are maybe a little more susceptible to it than others of really sort of seeing American history in isolation. And one of my interests has always been, well, how is American Jesuit history very much influenced by things happening outside? And sometimes that's actually a very easy thing to do. Okay, and then here are the three cases. I want to talk about Jesuits and religious liberty. I want to talk about Jesuits as refugees, and I want to talk about Jesuits and justice. So here we go. Jesuits and religious liberty. So we have to start in 1600. I have to do English religious history of the 16th and 17th century in 30 seconds. Okay? Tense. Lot of mistrust. Catholic versus Protestant. Protestant, various kinds of Protestant versus other kinds of Protestant. Enormous amount of distrust, and kind of, if you look at the history, justified mistrust, right? So you had the Pope's excommunication of Elizabeth in 1570. You have Guy Fawkes Day and the Catholic attempt to blow up Parliament. You have the association of Catholicism with treason. There's a lot of mistrust, and it really comes down to, in early 17th century England, of their Protestants being now in the political elite, sort of seeming to have won the day, thinking Catholics cannot be loyal citizens or subjects, and Catholics feeling on the basis of how they're being persecuted and the legal prejudices that they are being excluded from civil society. And the Catholics are, at this point, sort of spread. There's some that are living in England in a kind of don't ask, don't tell world, or they're on the continent. and they have toeholds in Spain and in Rome and in the lowlands, the French lowlands. And it's in this context that English Catholics are trying to figure out how can we break through the loggerheads that we're in, of somehow being participants in English society and at the same time true to our Catholicism. And what they developed might be called a low papal solution to the concern of Protestants that as Catholics they couldn't, because the Pope had excommunicated the Queen, because the Pope had claimed the right to depose heretical monarchs. The English Catholics are thinking if we develop a kind of a low papalism that completely respects the church's the Pope's involvement in ecclesiastical affairs and theological questions, but separates that from civil society, the organization, and the operations of the state. Now, this circulates, and Jesuits are not actively participating in this. In fact, if you look at Jesuits in Europe in the 17th century, and you even look at figures like Robert Bellarmine, a prominent theologian, did not like this at all. But these English Catholics kept pushing for it, and this is where we get to the Calvert solution. Calvert was an advisor to James I. He was he reverted to Catholicism while he was on the King's Privy Council and Parliament. He had the profound trust of the king, and despite all of this, on the basis of personal loyalty, James gave Calvert, even as he publicly reverted to Catholicism, a title, Lord Baltimore, which is a castle in Ireland, and gave him a charter for a colony in the United States. And Calvert's goal was to establish a colony that would allow for the free exercise of religion by Catholics. And it fell under the rubric of this kind of low papalism, that he kept attesting, even if the monarch is excommunicate, we will be loyal. And how did he show that? By his personal example, by the example of his allies, by the example of his family. This is how a Catholic colonial proprietor winds up in Maryland, and how laws get to be on the book, at least initially, that allow Catholics the free exercise of religion by doing what? The colonial charter is religiously neutral. There are no other colonies like that. Those of you who know Massachusetts history know that for sure. If you know Virginia history, that's for sure. No such thing. Very progressive for the day, you could call it. And what Calvert managed to do was get the Jesuits to sign on. English Jesuits, but Jesuits, and to get the Superior General in Rome to approve the Maryland mission of the English province of Jesuits. Now, this is kind of important just to notice that the Jesuits were not point men in this project, but they wanted to go into the missions, they wanted to serve the Catholics in Maryland, they wanted to go to the New World in order to work with indigenous peoples, and this was a compromise that they were willing to make. They had to agree, at least nominally, not to evangelize the natives, because that would scandalize their Protestant neighbors in Virginia and up in Massachusetts, and actually not to evangelize Protestants either, just to tend to the Catholic population. And once they got there, they pushed the envelope a little bit. The Calverts tried to rein them in because they realized how problematic this could potentially be. But at the end of the day, what happens when you look at the Calvert solution is that with even though the standard legal, this compromise really only worked in its purest form for about 15 years. What I'd like to argue is, and others have argued it, is there was a sort of a hard wiring in this Maryland Catholic population that we can deal with a separation of church and state. We can deal with a state that does not favor Catholicism, and we'll do our best to thrive in it. One other thing about what the Jesuits agreed to, and it's unlike the Jesuits that followed the French or the Spanish, they agreed to no financial support from the colony, which Calvert wasn't going to give them anyway. And what they got was, like any other colonist, land in proportion to the number of Jesuits and indigenous servants that they brought over in the 1630s. So it was the revenue from this farmland that would support the life and the work of the church, and that was there because the state wasn't going to provide it, and the Catholic population was not really in a position to endow things. But it's part of what keeps the separation of church and state. Okay, if we go, even with all of the back and forth, I mean, Charles I gets his head chopped off and Cromwell takes over. That's bad for Catholics. William and Mary get crowned after the so-called Glorious Revolution. That's bad for Catholics. And there are repercussions in Maryland. A couple things never happen. Except once, the Jesuits are never expelled. And the Catholics themselves, again, they get taxed. They get prohibited from serving in the military, so they get taxed twice. They can't send their children to schools. They send their children abroad. They get taxed for that. I mean, they get hammered. The fact of the matter is that they're never expelled, and there's never an attempt to eradicate Catholics from the population the way they would have been expelled from Virginia or Massachusetts. And again, this idea I have that there's sort of a hardwiring appreciation for religious liberty. Even when we don't get it, we know that's an ideal because we've lived it, and there's an echo of it that we're favorably experiencing now. You get to, let's go to the late 18th century, and we get the Carroll family. Catholic elite landowners in Maryland. We have Daniel, who signed the U.S. Constitution. We have Charles, who signed the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And we have John, who was educated by the Jesuits, who became a Jesuit, who at the suppression, we have to come back to that, and so no longer Jesuit, became the first bishop. The Carrolls were very involved in the movement for independence and the war for independence, and could present in these negotiations the benefits of full religious freedom and liberty. And I think this is now getting a little bit anecdotal. We know that John Carroll and James Madison were ultimately good friends. And John Carroll, first as just a member of the Carroll family and then as bishop, had a lot of interactions with James Madison, and as the Bill of Rights was being developed, could really testify on behalf of this Maryland Catholic experience that Catholics can indeed operate in a society where there's separation of church and state, and they want this and can support it and will not, despite all the reputations of Catholics wanting to topple Protestant kings and governments. That's not the case here. And if you go to Montpelier today, and you go, Montpelier is Madison's house, and you go into the receiving room where there's a set of busts that Madison put there to inspire conversation when visitors come. You have other founding fathers who also have in the corner a cleric in stole and cassock, and that's John Carroll. So this is how important that voice, that Maryland voice, was representative of how important that Maryland voice was, and how on board sort of the Jesuits were as the clerical presence of the church in the colonial period. Okay. So here's colonies and the Mid-Atlantic region. Is there a legacy for that? Yeah, and I think actually a pretty important one. That in the 19th century, when we know that in European Catholicism and in Papal Catholicism and in Jesuit Catholicism, there was a very strong negative pushback against liberal movements, a whole set of papal encyclicals that sort of condemn certain principles that we would say are integral to the Bill of Rights: freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, separation of church and state. As for a whole variety of reasons, the 19th century church in Europe was opposing, including Jesuits. In the United States, we don't have that. In the 19th century, yes. Are Jesuits, when it comes to papal supremacy ecclesiastically, are they very strong on that? Absolutely. Is there a kind of classic Catholic, tribal, derogatory idea about what Protestants are? Absolutely. But when it comes to the Bill of Rights, when it comes to actively making sure that their works are only attended by Catholics and keeping a distance from Protestants? Absolutely not. Protestants are working partners in civil society. Our schools are what they are. They may be overwhelmingly Catholic in the 19th century, but we're not out to undermine liberal democracy as we understand it in the United States. And that would not have been like a goodly number of Jesuits in the 19th century in continental Europe. Different situation, I would say, resonating with this sort of hard wiring that begins with the Maryland experience. We also know in the 20th century, theologians like John Courtney Murray and the tremendous impact he has, bringing, again, I would say, the American experience of separation of church and state and religious liberty as one voice to the council to make a theological argument for the church to sort of re-express its understanding of what the ideal relationship is between the church and the state. Or even Gus Weigel, who taught, another Jesuit, similarly mid-20th century, taught at Woodstock, the theologate in Maryland, on ecumenical relations. Well, Catholics have always been a vibrant population surrounded by Protestants and had managed to find a way for that to work. Practically, how about thinking about that working in principle? And then I would like just the shadow side. A shadow side of this particular thread is the Jesuit involvement in slaveholding. Because that land, which protected their religious liberty and was constitutive of that separation of church and state, that allowed Catholics to operate in the colonial period freely, came at a price. And that was that the farms, which had started as working with indentured servants who were mainly Europeans, with the other plantations in Maryland and the Mid-Atlantic region, transferred to enslaved labor. And by 1700, that's who was working these Jesuit plantations, generating revenue for both the community's living situation and the works of the society. Okay, Jesuits as refugees. Good. Jesuits as refugees. So here, I mean, really particularly Jesuits as refugees and not Jesuits as migrants. And so, how does this story get told? Well, we have to come back to the suppression. And the suppression, there's a configuration of forces. Some of it is coming out of the absolutist monarchs who want more and more control over their territory and operation of things like schools. Some of it is forces opposing the Jesuits that are coming more from within the church, a religious movement called Jansenism. And then religious orders and other people involved in the missions, the Office for Propagation of the Faith, and other religious orders that were sort of rivals of the Jesuits, not just rivals in terms of what territory they had, but in approaches to the process of global evangelization that was happening in the early modern period, and into the 18th century. So the society was suppressed ultimately by a papal brief in 1773. Just as a side story, there were about 25 Jesuits on the east coast of the United States. The only priests in the colony, 1773, were Jesuits. And here's the letter that they get on the the letter that they get from a guy named Richard Challoner, who's the bishop in London, who is informing them that the order is suppressed and they need to sign a statement indicating their awareness of that, and that they will now serve as diocesan priests of the Bishop of London, who is who this Richard Challoner is. Richard Challoner, people might know as he did an important revision of the English translation of the Bible, the Challoner edition. It's the same guy who knew who that is. Anyway, so here he has the letter, and it's brief, it's to the point, and he concludes it, ever yours, Richard. Your order exists no more. So that's what they did. This is when then Carroll returns. Carroll will become bishop, the Bishop of Baltimore. Shortly thereafter, he'll become archbishop, and you'll have bishops in Boston, in New York, in Philadelphia, and the fourth one is in Kentucky. Bardstown, Kentucky. So it was a matter of Western immigration already starting up and a little bit of French influence out there, so right outside of Louisville. How does the society get reformed? Well, two things. One is, because of the Pope's letter was a brief, so a category of the papal instruction that we don't really use anymore, it wasn't authoritative on its own, it had to be implemented. And now, the Bourbons in France and in Spain and in Portugal and in Vienna, they enforced that papal decree with an enthusiasm otherwise unseen in pre-modern Europe, seizing the property and redistributing it. Someone who didn't was Catherine the Great of Russia. And really the key reason is she and Frederick of Prussia had just divvied up Poland, and there were concentrations of Jesuits who were working in schools in Poland, and she wanted to keep those schools open. Also, Catherine was, well, now as empress, she was Orthodox, but she had been born as Lutheran, and the idea of following the Pope's instructions she didn't find that attractive. The Jesuits come to her and say, please let us suppress ourselves. And Catherine goes, Father, I see you are troubled by scruples. I will send my ambassador to the Bishop in Warsaw, who would have been the closest bishop, and find a solution to your scruples. And she went and she told the Archbishop of Warsaw, I think, she wasn't going to let the order be suppressed. And so they got a sort of a light nod from Rome that would be okay. Anyway, 1801, as soon as the society is suppressed, the Catholic Clement are trying to reestablish it somehow. 1801 that starts. 1805, a group of former Jesuits affiliate, here from the United States, affiliate with the Russian province. And so from 1805 to 1814, the Jesuits, who are for the most part US citizens, are Jesuits of the Russian province in a mission called the USA Mission. And as part of that, then suddenly people start coming, Jesuits who have been flocking to what's now Belarus, Lithuania, Russian Empire to become Jesuit, start trickling over to the United States. So that's the beginning of a refugee issue. But what really happens is with the full restoration in 1814, Catholics, now the church allows for the existence of Jesuits, but European governments, which are now very different from what they were in the 18th century, because you've got the French Revolution, they're now sort of constitutional democracies, but constitutional monarchies. They're not so interested in having the Jesuits. They see the Jesuits as representative of the worst form of Catholicism, highly papal Catholicism, and they don't want that kind of globalizing, extra transnational religion exerting influence on things like schools and parishes and other important works that the Jesuits were engaged in. So almost as soon as they're permitted to refound themselves in Europe, by the church, the state begins to kick them out. Now, we even have some Americans, maybe you've seen this quote before, there's conversation among some of the founding fathers in 1814 about what to do with this idea of Jesuits being reestablished internationally. And this is a letter from Adams to Jefferson. Shall we not have swarms of Jesuits here, as in as many shapes and disguises as ever a king of the gypsies himself assumed? Our system of religious liberty might oblige us to afford them an asylum, but if they do not put the purity of our elections to a severe trial, it will be a wonder. Right? So, again, in a certain learned, Enlightenment, Protestant world, really Catholicism is retrograde and Jesuits are the worst form of that backward thinking. However, Adams could be held to his word in that as they understood religious liberty, they are indeed obliged to let the Americans come. So, when William I kicked the Jesuits out of the Netherlands in 1815, when Tsar Alexander kicked the Jesuits out in 1820, when the French kicked the Jesuits out in 1830, when the Swiss Constitution prohibited them by law from Switzerland in 1848, when Austria kicked them out in 1848, when Mazzini kicked them out of Rome in 1849, so on to 1872, and Bismarck kicking them out of Germany, where were they going to go? And this was a question they themselves were asking, and an awful lot of them wound up coming to the United States. So that really the majority of Jesuits at work in the United States in the 19th century are not just foreign-born, not just accompanying migrants who are looking for political liberty and economic opportunity, but a group of people who are kicked out of their country because they are legally not allowed to live and work. All right. Now, these maps are probably going to be a little too fine. And this is just the Italians are going to wind up setting up missions in Alaska, in the Northwest, in the Southwest, in the Bay Area. And the maps are too fine here, but just to see a number, in Germany, about a sixth of the whole German province relocates to the United States. The Neapolitans, about a fourth, relocate to the United States. And of the Turin province in Italy, the majority members of their province at the very end of the 19th century are in the United States. And they're all working their own autonomous missions spread out across the United States. Now, so this is the great part actually in this lecture, but I'm great in the sense of convenient for a lecturer. And that I have 3 sample names here, and I can swap names in and out of this list. I have 3 listed, but I can swap names in and out really to fit almost any city in the United States where a group of people Jesuit-inspired invites a book talk. In Chicago, I can swap it out to refugee Jesuits who are working in Chicago. Any city on the East Coast for sure. And as you can see, I decided to pander to my audience a little bit by putting Johannes Babst in there. Let me first just make a reference to Pierre de Smet, right? Who, a Belgian Jesuit, kicked out, the Belgians were kicked out in 1815. There's a possibility of a novitiate for exiled Belgians in Switzerland. They sort of see the writing on the wall. They come to the United States. That group of Jesuit novices winds up in St. Louis, and those Belgian Jesuits really start working up the Mississippi River, the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys. Pierre de Smet will become the most famous of them, and will work his way deep into the Northwest. Will also recruit the Italian Jesuits from the Turin province to establish missions in what's now Montana, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and to engage in work with the American Indians up there. Here we have him, just the photograph is, he was trusted by, he was called the Great Black Skirt, and he was trusted as an honest negotiator by many of the Indian chiefs. Here he is negotiating in Vancouver a treaty with the US military. He supposedly traveled 180,000 miles over the course of his life, establishing missions. And actually, we all know it's not just Jesuits who have this problem. There's certain kind of administrators who sort of scatter good ideas all over the place, and you need sort of a second wave of, and they were the Italians who actually set the things up and built them, and then complained about this guy wandering around and counting things out of So Johannes Babst, again, Swiss, in Switzerland in 1847, because of the outcome of a war between Catholic and Protestant cantons, the Jesuits are expelled. He goes up to France. From France, he joins 40 of his Swiss confreres. They travel over, they land in New York. They're greeted by the provincial of the Maryland province, which would have been all the East Coast except for New York at the time. They're greeted by the provincial, a guy named Ignatius Brocard, who had been his superior in Freiburg. In other words, also a Swiss Jesuit, also a refugee, also ordered to come to the United States and set up and take governance in the province. He set up to Maine, right, to work with native populations, not knowing English, having to learn the more relevant language at the time is the native language. His first 5 or 6 years worth of letters down to his provincial, another provincial as time moves on, Bertrand Villiger, who is another Swiss Jesuit who was also kicked out at gunpoint in 1848. Those letters are in French. He comes down to Boston, becomes involved with Immaculate Conception and the foundations of Boston College, which right at the end of the 50s and early 60s is a school for scholastics, so for Jesuit training. The Jesuits that doesn't quite work out. They get sent back down to Washington. He stays and then becomes the first president of Boston College. What does he do in 1869 when his term is up? That New York region had belonged to sort of the French province, Canada, New York. They decided it should be made independent of France, and so it's called an independent mission. He becomes the superior of that and works out of New York then for the next 9 years, and then wanders around as he ages and dies in Baltimore. Let's see. So I was looking through some letters of that. It's again part of my pandering. And so here you'll see a letter from 1861, Boston College, January 30th. Now this is the Boston College that's downtown. It's the Boston College that's more about the training of Jesuit scholastics still at this point. But I mean, just think of a college administrator today. What does he start out with? We need books. We're not getting our books. We need Sestini's geometry, at least 3 copies, right? Sestini, Italian refugee who come to the United States and was working outside of Baltimore. A book on morals, a book on liturgy. The real reason I picked this out was I misread something initially. Up here it says, we're sending a particular scholastic, so Jesuit training. We're sending the scholastic Mr. Cuppins home. Now how I read it was, he has been a constant headache. What it really says is he has constant headaches. And he's just not suitable for study, so they send him home. Yep. Well, okay, so there's another letter that he wrote where he says, this is why they wouldn't let me give this lecture over at STM. There's another letter where he writes, he's writing the provincial, he's saying, really, everyone is doing quite well at the studies. He says, you'd scarcely imagine that so many of them are Americans, because each of them is equal to any European scholastic I can. Anyway, and then there's a little bit about John McElroy, who they're waiting for him to open up the church. And then at the end, so John Baptist, then P.S., again, the practical things an administrator has to think about. Where is the lamp oil? And where's the mass wine? So there you go, right? You've got the mind, you've got people, you've got the power and utilities, and you have the sacraments. So there you go. Eugen Boykel is just a favorite of mine because of some time I spent out on reservations in South Dakota. 1870s, Jesuits are kicked out of Germany, aren't let in until after World War I. He starts as a diocesan priest in Germany, decides he wants to be a Jesuit, does his novitiate in exile in the Netherlands, then comes to the United States, falls in love with the work on the reservations. When I was out there, I felt duty-bound to try to learn a little bit of Lakota. I found the first graders picture book. What's the footnote at the end? It's citing Boykel's grammar and dictionary for what is in effect now at the beginning of the 21st century an attempt to recover the language. Photographer, he brought a camera with him, so here's the German tourist from the Bavarian hinterland. What does his family give him? The camera. We have thousands of black and white negatives that he produced that capture Lakota life and culture from the late 19th and early 20th century, before a lot of these practices were lost for a variety of reasons. Maintained an active correspondence with the anthropologist Franz Boas, etc. And only here because, as a Jesuit, he could not work in Germany. So the legacy. So the legacy it's a number of things. One is this 19th century, it's a brick and mortar. These are the brick and mortar generations. They are going everywhere and building everything. Think of the buildings in Boston. I mean, think of the buildings on any East Coast city, but go all the way out to the west. 19th century, it's brick and mortar. You're, again, driving in the middle of South Dakota, and suddenly in the middle of the plains, this, the enormous, it's now painted kind of a light purple, but it's the church built by the Germans for their Native American congregation. The cover of the book, it's there's a building in there, the Chapel of Sacred Heart. It's the oldest building in the state of Iowa, it's still standing. Second is intellectual, especially because of the Italians. The Italians had a great interest in increasing the niveau of American Jesuit learning. Both the American Jesuits themselves was considered unsatisfactory in what their schools were providing. There's a great line that's a provincial named William Keller, who, so they had agreed that Neapolitan Jesuits could come over, and they brought their whole theology faculty with them to Woodstock, which was the one Jesuit theologian at the time. And the deal is that the Neapolitans would teach if their scholastics could be there with no tuition and free room and board. So the U.S. Jesuits agreed, and that was what started really from 1870 to 1970 was maybe the single most important Catholic theological faculty in the United States. But William Keller is reflecting on this and says, thanks be to God and Garibaldi, Italian nationalist, who kicked the Jesuits out. Thanks be to God and Garibaldi. If it were not for the Neapolitans, we would still be learning our ABCs. So this, again, how important these European Jesuits were, and just to be aware that they're refugees. And this is something that I hope gets studied more closely as Jesuits and other historians become more interested in the 19th century. We're the intellectual world right now is developing a lot of ideas about refugee studies and refugee trauma, and well, the fact of the matter is the bulk of Jesuits working in the United States in the 19th century kind of fit that category. So what are the implications? Or what are the implications as now we're looking into sort of the churches or the Jesuits and the United States and the effect of the schools and what the reservations did to the Native American populations. And the Jesuits and the Catholic religious orders kind of ought to fit into that scope. But the Jesuits and they're not Anglo-Saxons, right? And they don't know English. The natives often know English better than the Jesuits do, or the religious sisters do. Their motivation is not quite the same as bringing them into the American fold. There's all kinds of evangelical complications, but as a historian, it's like that. The broad strokes are important, but also the nuance within it. And what did it mean, even for someone like Baxt, who was tarred and feathered, that he didn't know English for the first few years that he was out there, and he didn't see, at least at first instance, he didn't see his goal as making the Penobscot more U.S. American, the way that so much of that is. Are there problems with assimilation and cultural obliteration and all that stuff? Absolutely. But as someone looking at the Jesuit issue, what are the ways in which what Jesuits were, and what their cultural connections were and their language capacities were? How did that shape things? Okay. So, there's only 10 minutes left. I'm going to tell you what the big theme is, but I'm not going to be able to get into the details because I do want to leave some time for Q&A. And that is, this is maybe a little bit of my own life as a Jesuit. And the way that, a little bit of the way that I was raised, coming into the society in the 80s and the 90s, is Jesuits are very interested in justice questions and social justice questions and the faith that does justice. And immediately the citation then goes to the General Councils 31, 32, 33, 34. And it's not that a lot is said about what happened before that. But as I think of myself as a young Jesuit, there's sort of the suggestion, maybe this is my sensitivity as a medievalist, it's a dark age. until the Enlightenment of the 31st, 32nd, 33rd congregation. And one of the things that is just currently came up is I had to overcome that, because that's just really not the case. There are all kinds of ways in which what was articulated in those congregations is enormously inspiring, and it expresses the relationship of faith and the common good in civil society in a particular mode. But, and this is, John Ryan was not a Jesuit, but this is about the social question as it was emerging out of Catholic social teaching at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. We cannot make earth heaven, but we can make the life and labor of the masses more humane and more pleasing to God through better distribution. Higher wages for the underpaid, social insurance, profit sharing, co-partnership, cooperative production and taxation, insurance against sickness, old age, and unemployment. I mean, the sad thing is you could imagine somebody saying that right now, right? And Jesuits signed on to that program from the get-go. And in some ways you could say their concern with even religious liberty it's a kind of a justice question and a willingness to understand, you know, that in a mode of Catholic expression in a particular way. So, labor and the social order, civil rights I was going to touch a little bit on the race question. John Lafarge, early 20th century Jesuit involved with the civil rights movement. You can pick any number of institutions where the question of integration was a very hot topic. There was a survey that Jesuits did in 1947 to try to figure out how many of their schools would admit a black student. And something like 66% would admit a black student. How many had black students? Well, half as many, right? And then that half as many was distributed actually at the college level among 3 schools: Fordham, University of Detroit, and Seattle. And there they are trying to work, cracking that up, and with, you know, as much intransigence among Jesuits as eagerness to solve the problem. And then the Central America, which is very familiar to you, I hope could be, but I want to be mindful of the time, and it's 10 of, and so there you go. A little bit of the chronology, a little bit of geographic scope. There's 3 threads of Jesuits struggling to work between the pivot between working with settlers and indigenous, or churched and unchurched. A little bit of geography. We got both coasts and the Midwest in. And then these 3 issues of religious liberty, refugees, and justice. Thank you again very much for coming out, and I'd be happy to take questions.
So yes, anyone, any questions? Probably we have time for 2.
I always tell the graduate students when I was director of the doctoral program, never answer a question for more than 2 minutes. So we might even be able to fit in a third.
Well, I was tempted to stand up and sing an army of youth flying the standard of truth when I saw your Daniel Lord picture there. But I'm more interested in sort of what's like, what happened to Father Feeney?
Oh, so a lot of characters I would like to talk about, they fall on the editing room floor. So I don't talk about it.
The context is Charlie Gallagher's work on the spies and Boston Common and all that sort of stuff. So that's why I was thinking.
Yeah. No, and World War II per se, I don't get into a lot of weeds on that. I just have to admit, and I really did. Because of course he's interesting, and when I was a scholastic, I worked down at St. Paul's, or when I was a deacon at St. Paul's in Harvard Square. Part of it was sort of trying to find cases that you could extrapolate from. And at least in Feeney's case, it's very particular and very intensive, and it's suggestive of a lot of things going on in Catholicism. But I'm going to say a little bit tentatively, not I'm not sure exactly how to find a lot of cases that he is representative of.
And your interest is a society, the
Yeah.
society of Jews.
Right.
So,
Right.
how,
Yeah.
Maybe just to follow up on the same question in a larger context, you mentioned quite a bit about Italians and French and Germans. The Irish connection, Irish Jesuits, you can say a word about that in the history of America.
Yeah, so Irish Jesuits, again, would be actually most important in New England. And they are another group that sort of falls through the cracks of the book, I have to admit. Individuals will come up, but in general, what the easiest groups to follow and to see sort of larger impact are, in fact, the Belgians, the Italians, the Swiss, and the Germans. And the Irish they're kind of everywhere, right? That has to be said. But yeah.
Could you talk? Could you talk a little? I'm sorry, yeah. Could you talk a little bit about your process in what you did decide
Yeah.
to include? 'Cause it sounds like you
Yeah.
it was tough. I can see how.
Yeah. So it started as lectures to novices. And the novices are coming from, at the time it was all 10, now it would be all 4 provinces. And fair treatment across the board became a really high priority. And also I would realize a bit of a difficulty for me in that I would fall into a category of Jesuit that somebody on the West Coast or in the Midwest might say that why is it that the Appalachian Mountains are a harder divide to cross than the Atlantic Ocean? And so I had to work pretty hard. That was where the learning curve was for me. Especially as we got more into the 20th century, also a little bit more difficult for me to sew together and make a coherent story for. That's a little bit, to get back to the Irish question, is first of all distinguishing, say, between Irish immigration, which you don't find in terribly large numbers in the society until the later period. And then you have this transition around 1900 when suddenly it is in fact Jesuits who are born in this country who are entering, people that are born in this country. There's sort of there's a Catholic infrastructure, family infrastructure in place that the Jesuits that are working are native born, I guess you would say. So, and then just trying to run across cases that were emblematic. So on the social justice question, or the labor schools, I mean, Boston, you have a crucially important labor school and industrial relation office that Jesuits become involved in setting up. And you have them in New York, you have them in St. Louis, you just have them all over the place. But I could pick one. And so I could pick someone. So I could pick someone like Leo Sweeney, who was of the more intellectual sort, who's trying to do already in the 40s and 50s, using the social sciences to analyze social problems, and to try to get Jesuits. Here's another interesting one of trying to get more Jesuits to go into the social sciences, which we also think of as much more recent. But he's doing it really, certainly in those first years after World War II. So the intellectual. Then you've got someone like Lord, who is using his connections with the sodalities, which was really the best Jesuit connection to parishes and families, right? Not necessarily men that were going to our schools, but sort of ordinary families. So that sort of is a middle category. And then again, I developed these, any historian does this, relationships, friendships with these historical characters. And there's this wonderful Neapolitan refugee named Carmelo Tronchesi. All he wanted to do was be a Latin teacher. And what happens to him? He gets sent to El Paso. And he becomes a kind of a community organizer on behalf of Hispanics who are in the pecan shellers union who are being taken advantage of by the pecan shelling industry. And so it's a bit of, so social order labor movement. You find someone who's the egghead, right, and the pamphleteer, and the guy who's actually in the trenches, and sort of says, here they go, moving right along. And there, with those 3 cases, it satisfied at least 3 or 4 provinces of Jesuits. It's equity.
Okay, it's 1-to-1, so just to be mindful to everybody, thank you for coming and have a good day.